system in the country came under the Transportation Committee, Transportation Infrastructure, T&I. But this came under the old D.C. committee. This goes back to the days of President Eisenhower. And so when we were putting together transportation bills, you know, whether it was TLU or whatever the imagination was, Metro's funding wasn't included in that. There was no grab bag for Metro to get money outside of the annual federal appropriation. So we went a separate route through this committee to get the authorization bill together. But that's one of the reasons I think that money was not as forthcoming. Of course, secondly, although the Metro system operates in 3 different jurisdictions, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, when it comes to transportation funding, it's a grab bag. And whether it was under the Federal Transit Administration or UMTA, its precursors, you really didn't, our money coming from there, we're not able to get it in the same way because we weren't on the same list. We operated independently and separate. That's why Metro needed its own funding legislation that we put forward.
So, but the consequence, if the funding doesn't happen, I mean, it wasn't in the President's first budget. If these things don't come to fruition, what do you see of it?
Yeah, there's a $6 billion documented need. Our legislation addresses $3 billion of it, which is half federal and half local dedicated revenue, which they never had before. Under the President's budget, there would have been nothing in there originally, and that's why we were grateful that the House put it in, and then nothing proceeds. And by the way, if the federal government doesn't put their $150 million in, the local jurisdictions may decide not to, so it's almost a $300 million hit. But it looks like it's on its way.
Ms. Jeter, let me ask you real quickly in the brief moments that I have here. As our chairman was talking about the manual versus automatic, can you talk a little bit about sort of the morale and things that you're seeing happening now? Because I really get concerned that when we have federal employees and the public at large traveling here, I mean, obviously any crash is devastating. You were quoted as saying, quote, "We haven't received anything that would make us think this was an isolated incident. I do need to know that this is not going to happen again. I do have people out there who are afraid," end quote.
Yes. You know, as operators report to work every day, I think the main thing to remember is that we are trained to be professionals, but your own basic need for survival and your instincts kick in, you know, at some point. And because early on in the investigation we had received information from different operators that there had been other instances where even though a crash had not taken place, that their train did not respond to the commands, or the wayside equipment did not command the train as it should have. And so for that reason, yes, we do have employees that are apprehensive about whether or not this will occur again. But I do believe that as professional as we all try to be in our occupations and as we report to our jobs, the operators will continue to work. Those who would like to go back to the bus and maybe don't have the stomach anymore for operating a train, I'm sure that Mr. Kupacek will make sure that they have the opportunity to do so.
And real quickly, I have only seconds left here, but maybe if each of the three of you could just address, what's the #1 thing you'd like to see us do?
Well, certainly, as Mr. Micah said, getting good funding in place for safety, getting a long-term transportation bill with sufficient resources so not only WMATA but transit systems across the country can address their fundamental needs is critical.
Thank you. Sorry, my time's short, Ms. Jeter.
I think the funding is essential no matter what you talk about, whether you talk about training, whether you talk about enhanced technology, you need dollars, no matter what.
Yeah, 2 things. First, adopt the Metro Compact amendments. The federal government has not adopted their share. I think that enhances the annual funding, $150 million, which is put in. And secondly, I think we ought to take a shot at some of the stimulus money and bring it right here to correct these problems right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I want to recognize that Mr. Tewitt has agreed to join us now. Let me just do a brief introduction, and then I'm going to have to swear Mr. Tewitt so that he can respond to questions. Mr. Patrick Tewitt is currently the Associate Chair and Head of the Masters of Arts Program in Theater in history and criticism at the Catholic University of America. He has also taught at the University of Notre Dame and the Ohio State University. At the time of this accident, relevant to this hearing, Mr. Tewitt was in the front of the second car of the train, train 112, the one that actually came forward and struck 214, and he helped people exit the train after the collision occurred. Mr. Tewitt, it is the custom of this committee to have witnesses sworn who are prepared to provide testimony. Could I ask you to stand and raise your right hand? Mr. Tewitt, do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give to this subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Let the record show that Mr. Tewitt has answered in the affirmative, and I will now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Northern Virginia, Mr. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask my predecessor, Mr. Davis, if we don't amend the compact for Metro, is the federal money tied up until we do?
No, my understanding is it's not tied up. One of the reasons the administration didn't fund it is because under the law, without the compact being amended, they weren't obligated to fund it. But I think this just puts it in motion, and it makes it a lot easier to get money in the out years. $150 million in this environment is tough.
With respect to my colleague, Mr. Chafitz's question, is it not true that Metro has either the highest fare box recovery rate or the second highest in the United States? Do you know?
Second highest.
Second highest. So the users are, in fact, certainly paying their fair share.
I think they are, as somebody who uses it.
And until recently, well, until this legislation, most of the financial burden in terms of subsidies has fallen on the state of Maryland, the District of Columbia, and the localities in Virginia. Is that not correct?
That is correct. That's where the subsidies have come from, right out of local and state budgets.
Is there any other subway system in America that bears the brunt of almost 15 million visitors from all around the country, indeed all around the world, other than the Metro system and Metropolitan
Yeah, I mean, New York may. I don't know the answer, but New York has a state funding mechanism and a completely different mechanism. It was built at a different time, different era.
And isn't it true, Congressman Davis, that perhaps the largest single beneficiary daily of the Metro system being here is, in fact, the federal government moving its federal workforce?
It's federal government moving its workers. It's tourists who come here to visit their nation's capital. You know, we're not, the Moscow subway system is an elaborate system, and they didn't chintz on it. I mean, they funded it. This was a statement of what their government, what they wanted the world to see their government. Unfortunately, I don't think it's been the same here.
I think that's really a good point. This is the nation's capital. It's arguably been called the capital of the free world, and the federal government has some responsibility beyond the initial construction costs of trying to help make sure that system remains healthy and safe, and indeed, hopefully, can be expanded in what is, after all, a non-attainment region in terms of air quality, with, by some measurements, the second worst congestion in the United States.
Yeah, and that was President Eisenhower's vision, that this would be the nation's subway system, that it wouldn't just be another local subway system competing with all the other local subway systems.
Ms. Jeter, you were being asked about previous statements you made about the nervousness of the workforce, and of course, I do think it's important to put in perspective the tragedy notwithstanding. In the 33 years of operation of the Metro system, it has functioned on a daily basis as one of the safest transit systems in the United States. Is that not correct?
That is correct.
And as a matter of fact, I think we've had a total of 3 accidents, major accidents, in the history of the system. Is that not correct?
That's correct, but I'd also like to add, Mr. Conley, that even though we have not had those types of accidents, as a rail operator, I know that when an accident occurs, it occurs.
Absolutely. And one of the things that occurred, Ms. Jeter and Mr. Millar, you may want to comment as well, was because we were having what's called Series 1000 cars, some of the very earliest cars in the system, in the front of the train that crashed into the stationary train. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the Series 1000 cars are, in terms of crashworthiness and safe haven for passengers, a lot less safe and reliable than more recently constructed cars. Is that correct?
They are the weaker built cars.
And is it also true to your knowledge that there is no federal standard in terms of crashworthiness and safety of passengers on transit systems? There is for rail systems like Amtrak, but there is not for transit. And my time's up, but perhaps you'd like to comment on that before.
Not that I know of.
What there is the federally endorsed voluntary standard system, crashworthiness, that I describe in my testimony that's been developed. Obviously, older cars were built under the practices of the time. As newer cars are built and purchased, they will be bought presumably to the standards of that time, and cars that are bought 10 years from now will have to their standards. It's a continuously moving and improving target over time.
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but this is an issue that has come out of the regional delegation's examination of the tragedy of June 22nd, this anomaly in federal regulation where we do regulate for hard rail cars on railroad systems, but not for transit. It's a voluntary system of safety, and this committee may want to take a fresh look at that. I thank the Chair.
I thank the gentleman. I'd now like to recognize the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Holmes Norton, who has been a driving force, along with Mr. Cummings and Mr. Connolly, on this issue. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Now, Mr. Miller, your testimony is replete with standards. I mean, they're the kind of standards that I think the public thought applied, indeed were required. I think most people would have thought they almost encyclopedic. First, I want to know who has adopted these standards.
Yes.
And then I want to ask you why you believe the federal government has done no more than give you a charge to develop standards while apparently not giving anyone the charge to enforce standards.
Yes. Standards are developed under federal law that allow for industry-developed standards. The development of our standards has been funded both by our own members as well as the Federal Transit Administration when it comes to rail transit and bus transit standards. When it comes to commuter rail standards, those have also been funded or have been worked on by the Federal Railroad Administration as well. It is up to each transit property themselves to adopt standards.
So what is the usual practice? When you develop standards, have you found that transit systems across the United States readily develop these standards, and did WMATA do so?
Yes, we have found that once the standards are developed and agreed to, they're called consensus standards because there is agreement that this is the right standard, and then we find transit systems do in fact use those standards because they want to improve safety, and the standards do that.
As to whether WMATA they are common carriers, and of course in our law you'd expect them to want to improve and to do so. Let me ask Mr. Davis, who knows so much about the system and began us in this process. You've heard the testimony here that we have a long list of standards. Do you believe the time has come, Mr. Davis, for the Federal Transit Administration or some agency of the federal government to, in fact, enforce some at least minimal standards for safety of passengers in transit systems throughout the United States?
Sure. But let me note one other thing. There is, to my knowledge, no identifiable grant source to buy rail cars outside of the New Starts program. So when you start talking about our ability to buy rail cars and the like, it's got to comes right out of Metro's high. They can't go to the federal government for that. Is that right?
Do you think that are you implying that the federal government does not have the authority on the Interstate Commerce Clause to require minimal standards?
No, I think they have the authority.
Let me ask Ms. Jeter. Ms. Jeter, you talk about people aging out No, these are union jobs, which, as far as I know, are high-paid union jobs.
Yes.
May I offer again my condolences to you and to the excellent workforce at WMATA. Congratulate you, especially for what you did during the inauguration. You were way beyond the call of duty then.
Thank you.
Here you talk about operators aging out. The operator who sacrificed her life, worked her way up the ladder. Is there some difficulty in attracting people to these highly paid union jobs?
I think there is to a certain point. Let me say this. WMATA, the union, we have right now the majority of the 7,900 so employees, the majority of them have less than 10 years of service. So you have a relatively young workforce, young in the amount of time that they have been on the property. I think that where transportation is concerned, it is, although it is a very well-paid position, it can be something that some of us don't enjoy doing. As a person who has been employed by WMATA for 30 years, there are many Christmases and Thanksgivings that I did not spend with my family. There were plenty of PTA meetings.
But is there a workforce ready and willing to step up as the workforce ages out?
I think that there have been some changes that have been made. I know as soon as Mr. Cato got on board, probably about 6 months after him and I both, I became president and he became the general manager, we had a conversation about bringing people in full-time versus part-time so that they would be willing to step into regular positions. I don't think that WMATA has any trouble recruiting. I think that transportation, because of its stringent rules and regulations, have trouble staying, to be honest.
I see my time is up. I hope we have a second round, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you for your testimony. Mr. Millar, when I was looking at the Washington Post this morning, they were talking about the NTSB and their letter that they apparently sent to you all within the last few days, and your immediate response, which I thought was good. And I was just wondering, is the level of automation on the operation of the WMATA system unusual compared to other systems?
I would say yes. I would say that at the time that it was designed, only the BART system in California really had comparable, and WMATA really even went a step further. On the other hand, around the world, newer systems now have much more advanced systems. So at the time, absolutely. Today, not so much.
And in your opinion, what are the particular risks that will come with relying on such a high level of automation?
Well, you have to make sure of the proper design of the automation. You certainly have to make sure of the proper maintenance of the automation. You have to be very careful that when any changes are made, for example, if a new technology fix is intended to be brought in, that there aren't unintended consequences. You certainly have to make sure that the employees are well trained and well familiar with both how to maintain and how to use the service. You also have to make sure that you don't expect it to deliver more than it can deliver. So you always have to use your technology appropriately. This is no different.
And how do you make sure that the things that you just said are done? I mean, one of the things that the other day, I went to get my brakes fixed, and when I got in my car, literally, my foot went down to the metal, and the car wasn't stopping. I won't name the agent, the company, but the reason why I mention that is that I think that when you have automation, certainly it takes human beings to make sure that all of that stuff works, and I'm just trying to figure out how do you make sure that you've got everything, you know, like, it seems like when you're depending upon a train to stop or to do certain things, and it could result, as here, in the loss of life and significant injuries. How do you make sure that you, I guess, have layers of compliance and making sure that people do what they're supposed to do? And I'm not saying they don't. I'm just
couple of ways I would answer your question. First, each transit agency in America is a public agency. It has its own procedures. It has its own adopted processes. It has its own responsibility to train its employees in those processes. More recently, over the last few years, APTA, in cooperation with FTA and others, has been developing standard operating procedures and maintenance procedures that can be used. You gave the example of brakes on your cars. That's one of the very early areas that we develop standards in, so that employees can have a standard to work against. We also now have a certification program in our industry. I believe WMATA participates in that certification program. So the men and women can know what the standards are, know what the procedures are, be trained in those, tested in those to make sure that they are well qualified to work. So those are usually the general ways that these things are handled.
And in response to 2 WMATA accidents in 2006, the NTSB determined that the lack of an aggressive program of rule compliance testing and enforcement on WMATA system contributed to both 2006 WMATA accidents. And how does WMATA rule compliance testing measure up to other systems?
We have worked with WMATA and other transit systems in this particular area. Recently, WMATA has been particularly placing emphasis on safety and compliance with safety. And again, I believe when the WMATA folks testify later in this hearing, they could tell you much more about that than I'm capable of relating to you. If there is a follow-up question after that, I would be happy to supply it to you and for the record as the committee might desire.
Ms. Jeter, I heard the last few seconds of your testimony, and I mean, when you answer to a question, one of the things that you said is that they need the resources. I think you were talking about funding. I caught the answer on it. How confident did you feel? Do you feel that if the money were there, that it would be used for the right things?
I feel relatively confident. I also think that along with funding, you also have to have regulations, sure, and you have to have those criteria in place where they're supposed to do it. One of the things that in your questioning, you were talking about the training that people would have to have in order to do all of this. Funding provides the money for the training, but I also think that we have to stop paying lip service and actually doing it. If it's necessary to train the entire fleet of employees in a particular new technology, then all of them need to be trained, not just part of them today and then 6 months later we get to the other part. By the time we get to the other part 6 months later, a number of things have occurred. So I think that's some of what we have to do. As an employee, I've watched where, 25 people go to training for one particular thing, and then we don't see that training anymore. We move on to the next thing. We have to stop doing that. I think we as transit has to stop doing that to ensure that all employees are trained on particular things, all things that concern any part of transit.
I see my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The Chair now is pleased to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Bill Bray, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize to the committee because I'd like to get into the weeds. Once a transit operator, always a transit operator. And I guess the question will be technically, but also from the union's point of view. One of the things that was developed in the early 70s and late 60s was this concept that automation was the thing of the future. It wasn't until late in the 70s we started seeing that you still have to have somebody in the cab. Now,
my question is this, as I remember in '78 when we were building our LRT system in San Diego, we were told by BART, we were told by Edmonton, we were told quietly out of D.C., was that the system of having automated operation with a manual override, which is basically what we have now, right, was not the way to go. Has anybody, that the fact is the opposite should be the way to go, have manual operation and an animated override. Now, there may be the issue of proximity of trains and everything else in this, but what we were told when we were talking to the people in the front line was that the fatigue of an operator was more when they were not operating the car itself, was sitting and basically just keeping an eye on the machine, than to physically operate the system. Has anybody done a study on the reaction time of somebody who is not actually operating the vehicle as opposed to somebody who is actually physically doing the operation?
Go ahead.
I'm not familiar with that particular, if there is such a study. I can tell you the question you've posed is an unresolved question. There are transit systems built today in the world that are fully automatic, no manual override whatsoever. There are transit systems in the world that have some automatic train control features, but much more heavily reliance on the operator. What there is clear agreement is that having automatic train protection systems, such as was included earlier testimony today about the in the Rail Safety Act last fall, there's no disagreement about that. That needs to be done and is being done around the world. But I'm not familiar with such a study. I will check our records, and if I find such a study, I'll be glad to make it available to you, sir.
Ma'am, from the labor point of view?
I believe that running a system automatic is the right system to run in. When you talk about delays that can occur, the train just runs smoother as a whole. I think that having a human being there stops whatever from occurring, whatever problems you might have with the system from occurring, and the operator can override it and put it in manual. But I do believe as an operator that running that system on automatic, we're supposed to have an automatic system. It should be able to run and run sufficiently.
But see, that's the theory, and we had the bells and whistles. You basically had the engineers that love to engineer everything and try to engineer the human factor out. But as we were strongly urged after BART got in operation, was do not ignore the impact on the human of not doing anything. That the mind ends up drifting off, there's a lack of concentration, so the reaction to an emergency is going to be much slower for somebody who's not actually engaged in the operation than somebody who is observing it and then is expected to impose on. I think that we've got to be open and frank. I'll give you an example. When you fly a B-2 bomber, they are being flown by the person in the pilot seat, but the computer can override and stop you from doing the wrong things. If we've got technology that's that sophisticated, one of the most sophisticated systems that America's ever developed, operating off that mode, we're operating on a 1970 mode that machines, computers can do it, and it was actually an afterthought that we put people on board as a backup. I'm not so sure that we shouldn't be taking the time to look at this, study this, and make sure the assumptions we made early in the 70s is the best assumptions going into the next century, because I think we need to legitimately say, we assume that the driver will respond to the crisis in a timely manner as opposed to the other way around. And I just think we should rethink that, because I just tell you personally, as somebody who was building a system back in the late 70s, I still remember being told again and again by drivers that, watch out for this system, it has this problem. And when the accident happened, Madam Chair, I just literally thought back to those warnings I kept hearing about that. Go ahead.
Can I respond? Because the other part of that is also, as operators, when you operate for 8 hours manually, you also run the risk of someone getting tired. So I think that it has a dual effect on individuals. As a seasoned operator, I say when you get tired and you feel yourself maybe not paying attention, get up, stand up. Do something other than just sit there and be lulled with the movement of the train. You have to condition yourself to know that being alert is your job. That's what you're supposed to do. When you're not operating that train in manual, you're supposed to be alert. You're supposed to know what that train is doing at all times.
Madam Chair, I appreciate the time. I think it may be time that we want to go back and study the human impact on this. We always are looking at the machines, but I think we've got to integrate the human factor, and that assumptions made 20, 30 years ago may not be reality today, and I think that we ought to openly and frankly discuss that at MAT.
Thank you, Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Tewitt, the chairman promised that on the second round of questions, we'd let you begin because we have not yet heard from your important testimony. An eyewitness who was involved in this accident. You have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony, please.
Thank you, Chairman, or Chairwoman, excuse me.
Could I just say that I've received word, Mr. Davis, that you may have to leave. I want to thank you for the chairman and the committee for taking time to follow through on what you began here when you were chair of the full committee. So if you have to leave, you would be excused with thanks and gratitude again. Mr. Tewitt?
I want to apologize first for my delay. I knew that I had to be here at 2 o'clock. I live in Kensington, Maryland. I decided for the first time since the accident to take the red line. I left my home at 12:37. I did not arrive here at Capitol South until 2:55.
The red line is being held up, if I just, because of the accident, I take it.
Yes. And the elevators weren't operating at Forest Glen, and there were a number of other problems that caused that delay. So I apologize, but please appreciate my frustration in even giving you that apology. On the afternoon of the 22nd of June, I was on my way to teach a night class at the Catholic University of America. I decided that night on a whim to save some gas, park at the Wheaton Metro, and take the red line down. I normally ride in the first car of the train, but on that evening it was hot, I was dressed for work, I decided to stay in front of an air conditioner on the platform at the Wheaton station, and because of that got on the second car of the train and sat on the forwardmost right-hand side facing forward near the forwardmost doors, if that helps at all. While riding the train, I read the paper, as I do in the tunnel, and then as we came out of the tunnel, approaching the Silver Spring station, somewhere around Silver Spring or Tacoma, I got a little tired and put down the paper, the operator came on and told us to expect a delay. This was a typical announcement. This was nothing unusual, but I could hear the conductor's voice or the operator's voice. She reassured us that we would take a delay, stop in between stations, and then start back up again. So as the train came to a stop somewhere south of Silver Spring or south of Tacoma, I don't remember which, I closed my eyes and relaxed a little bit. The train began to move again while my eyes were closed. I had put the paper down, and then somewhere in there, we got to a normal cruising speed, I'll call it, when I heard a screeching noise, a shuddering feeling came through the car. Someone yelled behind me that she believed we had derailed, and then one of the loudest bangs I've ever heard in my life. Everyone in the second car, and there weren't many of us, were thrown from their seats. I hit the seat in front of me. I don't really remember much of that, but I do remember being on the floor of the second car with a lot of dust, a lot of smoke, not much in the way of screaming, but all my belongings had been thrown to the front of that car. It's at that point, first of all, there was no noise. All the electricity was down. You could see the sunlight coming through, but it was very difficult to make out what was going on. A gentleman who had been sitting forward of me got to his feet and told everyone in the car we should go. Everyone get out of the car. So people did get up. We moved in an orderly fashion. Again, no screaming. A woman opened the lever, the emergency lever, to get the center doors open. The center doors did not open. I helped by reaching in and sliding one of the doors open to the left, and we proceeded to get people out of that car and onto the rocks below. It was quite a big jump. I mean, it's a good 4.5 feet, 4 feet up to the rocks at that point. So we helped lower people out of the car, and it's only at that point when I paused, looked to my left out of the door, and realized that the first car of the train was actually in the air. I could see debris on the ground, things thrown from the first car into the fencing. There was at least one man that I saw on the ground, khaki shorts, moving, but he did not look good. He was bleeding profusely from his legs. People were already moving towards him, so that the people in my car decided to just exit as quickly as we could, as safely as we could, and then move to the back of the car, or all the way to the back of the train. We helped people off the train. When everyone was out of our car, I noticed two gentlemen had gotten into the second car and were moving to the doors in the interior of the car. I got back onto the train to assist those two gentlemen. They were attempting to open the interior door that connects the second car to the first car. That door was stuck. I learned later that this was the car I was in was also a 1000 series car, and what had happened was that the roof of the car had actually dimpled like a soda can. If you take your Sprite can or something, turn it sideways, imagine it's like a car, and just press on the top. That's what happened to that second car. Because the roof was down, the struts that support that roof were also down, that prevented the door in the second car from opening enough for anyone in the first car to exit. We could also, there were two gentlemen with me, we could see as we were trying to remove that door that possibly we could take some ceiling panels down. We did that. That didn't work because the metal struts underneath that ceiling panel were stronger. We couldn't rip those out, so the door was stuck. We could hear the people at this point in the first car, and it was pretty chaotic. They were screaming, they were upset. I could see through the window there were about 4 to 5 people in the rearmost section of the first car. I could not see beyond that, which would be the rearmost doors, the side doors that open. You couldn't see past that because the flooring had crushed accordion-like into that section. So all the handrails, all the seating was askew. We had handrails and posts pointing towards us almost like toothpicks, and then 4 to 5 people trapped inside there. When this one young man on the other side realized that we could not open our door, he told us that he was going to break the glass. So he took his shirt off, wrapped it around his wrist, and started punching the glass. It's at that point that myself and the 2 other gentlemen moved out of the way to avoid the broken glass. At this time, and this is the first time that a first responder came to us, a WMATA operator, I don't know where from, but obviously not on our train, had come in through the third car into the second car. He had the vest, the walkie-talkie, goatee, and told us that we should just exit that car as quickly as possible, that he would take care of that situation as best he could, and that first responders were on their way. So we moved through the cars themselves. They were empty at that point. The second and third car were empty. We moved into, I believe, the fourth car, jumped from the car, and then just got more people out of the cars as best we could, helped lower them. Again, I did not see a lot of first responders at this point because I had not been to the back of the train itself. I don't know what the time was. I don't know how long this narrative would account for. But when we got out of the train and were moving people out, someone shouted that they needed doctors and nurses, and that was quite vivid for me because I was lowering a woman in scrubs from maybe the 4th or 5th car. She said, "I'm a nurse, but I'm hurt." And we said, "We need you." And she went to the first car. After that, we pretty much moved everyone to the back of the train. It was very confusing. We saw 2, I believe, plainclothes policemen in shorts with safety vests. Don't know who they represented, but they told us to stay away from the third rail, stay grouped at the back of the train. We had people wandering away from the scene. We had people, 4 passengers at the very least that I witnessed, who picked up their belongings at the end of the train and simply walked north. They left. And there were not enough first responders to prevent them from leaving, and certainly none of us had our wits about us to say, don't go. We just let them go. The firemen who arrived on scene went to the parking lot between the community gardens north of New Hampshire Ave, that New Hampshire Ave bridge, and the Job Row, I think it's Job Row Printing, that has a parking lot there. They could not get to us because we had fencing between the CSX tracks and the Metro tracks. There are 4 sets of tracks at that point by the New Hampshire Street Bridge. The Metro tracks are in the middle. There's fencing there to this day with barbed wire on the top. Firemen can't get to you. The firemen's equipment, their trucks and whatnot, could not get on the tracks. So they had to lug their gear, things like jaws of life, diamond cutting saws, and other equipment, on stretchers manually, carrying that equipment toward the first car. This is when we start to see people at the back of the train. So we just waited. We waited and took care of one another as best we could.
Okay. Thank the gentleman. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Holmes Norton, for 5 minutes.
I need to get on to Mr. Miller and Ms. Jeter, but I must ask you, were you injured, Mr. Tewitt? Mr. Tewitt, were you injured?
No, but I mean, I did have some soreness in my neck and back. I eventually was triaged along with the other people in the parking lot, and I just stayed. And towards the end of the evening, again, it was very confusing. Some of the first responders told people that, look, if we've got your name and number and we've looked after you, you're free to go, which I thought was a surprise.
Your testimony has been really indispensable to this hearing. It's riveting testimony. I'm sure it's going to be helpful to the NTSB as well. Let me, because I have only a short period of time, Mr. Miller, would you have advised WMATA to do what it now has done, to place the 1000 series cars in the middle and the more crash-worthy cars at either end? Yes or no?
Yes, that seems like a prudent thing to do.
Do you understand why they would not have done it before?
I don't know what information they might have possessed in that.
Let me ask you this. Therefore, faced with choices that you can pull 30% of your fleet that goes back almost 40 years, or put them in the middle. The choice should have been to put them in the middle so that either end would have the most crash-worthy cars. Have you ever recommended anything of that kind in your...
That is not a type of detailed recommendation we would normally participate in any way. I would caution that what looks like a very good idea, given the circumstances that we think we understand now, could, in a different set of circumstances, look like a very bad idea.
We will question the next panel on that. Ms. Jeter, it's important to hear your testimony about automatic versus manual. You know that some members of the public have been concerned about reports of a metro operator who seemed to be sleeping. I'll tell you one thing, it's easy to go to sleep on any kind of moving vehicle, especially a train. There was concern, and we are so pleased to learn that the operator didn't even have her cell phone with us, yes. So we know she was paying close attention. I understand what automatic does, but I really have to ask you, what is there? And shouldn't there be something that the operator has to do fairly often during the trip to keep her alert in light of, you know, human sacrifice, human instinct to get bored if you're just sitting there doing the same thing over and over again? Isn't there something more that should be done, either you or Mr. Miller think might be done to keep people alert?
Well, actually, we do. The operators are responsible for opening and closing the doors at this point. We're also responsible for giving out announcements. It's our job to listen to the radios and monitor the radios so that we know what is going on the railroad ahead of us. And
so you really think there is enough to keep people alert already?
I do.
And I see you shaking your head, Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller, in your testimony, I note that you say this fundamental system, you say that WMATA had adopted the fundamentals of the safety system. Yeah. also provides safe and effective service in other major cities. You named Boston, Atlanta, Baltimore, Miami, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. Do you believe that the system here is as safe as those systems you have enumerated in your testimony?
It's at least as safe. I have full confidence in the Metro system here.
In reading your testimony, Ms. Jeter, I sometimes, because I don't understand enough about trains, had to try to distinguish between what WMATA could have done and what was too costly to do, and you were generous in saying WMATA didn't have a lot of money to do what really needed to be done. You recommended retrofitting some of the cars. Given the age of this car and the kind of funds it would take to retrofit, and I suppose I should ask this question to Mr. Miller, 40-year-old cars, retrofit them, try to make them crash-worthy. Was that a real option for WMATA? Either Mr. Miller, and I'm trying to get at least one more question in. Yes or no, do you think that that was a real option?
I don't know the facts specifically here, but I agree with the fundamentals of your point, that if you're going to be retiring a car soon, you want to do only what's absolutely necessary to keep safety and operational efficiency.
We'll have to ask whether it was worth the investment. Let me ask about your testimony, Ms. Jeter, about car-borne monitors. You say that NTSB recommended car-borne monitors in every WMATA car to give advanced performance data. Now, would that have been costly? And do you believe that WMATA installed what it could that was not excessively costly, or that contraptions like this car-borne monitors could have and should have been installed in any case?
I think over the years, WMATA probably purchased new cars hoping to alleviate...
Sorry, say that again.
Over the years, WMATA purchased new cars hoping to alleviate the problems that had been identified. It would be harsh for me to say that they purposely did not follow.
No, but that's not my question. I'm trying to say, to distinguish, you talk about rollback, and there's some things that they didn't install.
Correct.
I'm trying to, do you think that WMATA, given the circumstances it faced, with Congress not providing the money, and of course you not, the system not having anything like the funds, it did what it could to prevent this accident? Assuming that it didn't have the money for whole new cars, or maybe even retrofitting cars.
Where this accident is concerned, to be perfectly honest, I think there was some there was part of the situation that was missed, either through supervision, whether or not it was monitoring that should have taken place after some of the circuitry was changed on the rails. I think that's a place where we probably need to go back and look at what the procedures are so that we would have the procedures in place. It's my understanding, and I understand we're out of time, but it's my understanding that once that Wheezy bond was changed, or once there was a problem identified with that Wheezy bond, there should have been certain things done to assure that it was operating as it should have been. And apparently it wasn't, because it's my understanding that Train 112 wasn't even seen. So if the train wasn't seen, why? Was that a bond that prohibited that train from being able to be monitored by either central control or some other manual?
Thank you, Ms. Jeter.
Source.
Thank you. Now I would like to recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Van Hollen, who has been an active and attentive member on this issue, a member of our full committee. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing us together on this very important issue. And I won't use the whole 5 minutes. I do want to thank our former colleague, Mr. Davis, who had to leave again, for his longtime leadership on the question of WMATA. And all of us from this region are very pleased that we were able to get the $150 million appropriation from the subcommittee, Appropriations Committee subcommittee, and obviously that's the first step in providing the federal component of the ongoing funding. To Mr. Tewitt, it's great to have a fellow resident of the town of Kensington with us, and thank you for sharing your story. And thank all of our witnesses. In fact, my colleague, Ms. Norton, asked some of the questions I was going to ask of the other two of you. So in the interest of time, Mr. Chairman, I will just move to the next panel. Thank you. I want to thank you.
I thank the gentleman. We want to thank each of you for your testimony here today. There have been, as always, there are a number of other hearings going on at the same time. Also, as you know, we've had votes on the floor. I will ask that you remain responsive if members who were not here at the hearing today have any questions that they would submit in writing. I would forward them to you, and we would ask that you respond to them within 5 days. But with that, I want to thank you for your testimony today, and I bid you a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.